Hello, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's top 10 Star Trek episodes that everyone else seems to hate that aren't that bad. So, this is kind of a companion piece to my underrated episode list where I talked about top 10 underrated episodes of Star Trek. But that was a bit different because that was about episodes that I thought were great that didn't get as much love as they should have. We're talking about episodes that people absolutely hate, like cannot stand and think are horrible. And I actually think aren't that good. Aren't that bad, sorry. And it doesn't necessarily mean that I love the episodes. Some of these episodes I think aren't that good. Some of them I think are kind of poor and not that good, but I don't think they deserve the hate that they get. Like, they get way much hate, where I think there's like much worse examples of episodes than these ones. These ones are fine and they're to varying degrees. Some of them I do love. Others I think are kind of bad, but not that bad. So and this is kind of also a companion piece to the video I just did of the top 10 episodes that I hate that everyone else seems to love. So now I'm talking about the episodes everyone else hates that I think are fine. And so I'm basing this off of a lot of reviews, comments, things I've heard on the internet or in person or anywhere. Just general opinions, and also on IMDB how they rate all the episodes. And some of them I hyper focus on IMDB, some of them not. But that's how I come up with my sort of popular opinion that I'm judging this on. So anyway, and you may think I'm inaccurate. You may think, well, not everyone hates this episode. I don't hate this episode. I don't know what you're talking about, Mark. But yeah, it's not a blanket statement that's going to apply to everyone everywhere. But from my experience, it applies to a general amount of people much more than it should. So, let me get into my list. I'll start with a few honorable mentions that did not make my list. My top 10, I should say. First honorable mention is Second Contact from Lower Decks. This is the first episode of Lower Decks. Now, this is one that I'm specifically going by IMDb because I actually hadn't heard anyone completely badmouth this episode. I heard a lot of people said it wasn't that good, which I agree wasn't that good. But I just went to IMDb to Lower Decks, and this was the lowest rated episode of Lower Decks. I'm like, really? People think this is the worst episode of Lower Decks? Now, I think this might be an issue with IMDb's rating system because there might have been a lot of people who just watched this first episode and gave up on Lower Decks. And so they voted down this episode as kind of a stand-in for voting down the entire show. Although there is a different button on this website where you can vote down the entire show, so why not just do that? But anyway, it might be a lot of people just jumping and watching this episode and nothing else and giving it a bad rating. Because they didn't like what they saw of Lower Decks. But I still don't think it should be the lowest rated episode of Lower Decks because it was actually kind of good. I thought it was a good introduction. It had the opening scene with Mariner swinging the bath around while she's drunk off her ass was hilarious, and the whole sequence of the zombies taking over the Cerritos and everyone acting nonchalant and Rutherford being on a date and they're just casually talking and all those zombies going, "Argh!" That was funny. So, does this deserve to be the lowest rated episode of Lower Decks? Absolutely not. The second lowest rated episode was the Peanut Hamper one, which is a bit close. I don't know if I'd call it the worst one. The one I would call the worst one was actually in the top 20, but I decided not to go there and talk about that one. But anyway, so my next honorable mention is Rosetta. Sticking with Modern Trek, Rosetta was an episode towards the end of season 4 of Discovery that just came. That was the last season of Discovery to come out as of the recording of this video. And I can't remember. It was either the second to last or third to last or fourth to last. It's in that final bit of episodes. And it was the second lowest rated episode of Discovery on IMDb. And again, I hadn't heard anyone else specifically badmouth it, but it was the lowest rated, second lowest rated. And I went to read all the reviews, and they were like brutal on this episode, calling it absolutely boring. Oh, one of the reviews that I read was titled "The Writers Need Therapy." Which I thought was funny, but I don't get. I actually thought it was a pretty strong episode. As when they're going to discover the species 10C, whatever that's bringing this thing that's going to destroy Earth and a lot of the Alpha Quadrant, and they travel to a different galaxy and they try to learn about these aliens and find that they're extremely alien. They find the remnants. It does have this really cheesy moment where like Burnham and the people who are going on this away mission, the shuttle mission, like are walking down the hallway with their clothes blowing in the wind and the cool reservoir dogs shot. I didn't make proper fun of that in my review, but that doesn't make this the second worst episode of Discovery. Come on, like this, there's way worse episodes of Discovery, like the one I talked about in other video I did of episodes I hate that everyone else seems to love, the Choose Your Pain, which was in like the top 20 episodes of Discovery. That's like 1,000 times worse than this episode. So I don't know why people pick on this episode. It's good. I actually liked it. Anyway, next honorable mention is Spock's brain. Sorry, I had to scream it like that because I know I'm going to get so much disagreement about this. And then I talked about how when I did my top 10 worst episodes in the entire Star Trek franchise, and I released each video, talking about each episode separately. It has a separate video for each episode. And every single video there was this guy who would come on, or this commenter who would come on, and every video would be like, Spock's brain! Spock's brain! How is this episode worse than Spock's brain? I don't think Spock's brain's that bad. Is it really bad of me to say? There was another YouTuber I saw recently who also was like, this episode's actually not that bad. And I agree. Like, I think it is a silly, nonsensical premise. I know the original series has a lot, like Abraham Lincoln floating in space and a giant hand grabbing the Enterprise, and was it a giant amoeba eating the galaxy? Like, yeah, so the original series is not want for ridiculous, stupid ideas, but I will grant you this is probably the most ridiculous and dumbest idea out of all of them. But if you look at it a certain way, and I guess I'm looking at it from a child's perspective because I saw this episode when I was like 11 or something, it actually works as a kid's show. Like, it makes sense, it's suspenseful, it has a storyline. You just have to ignore a lot of the nonsense, which is what a lot of kids shows are like, because they're geared towards children who don't really need logic and they can just base it off of wild fantastical ideas. It's a fantasy. If you look at it as a fantasy that doesn't really keep to reality, like, people being able to steal someone's brain and being able to survive, then it works in that regard. It's actually a well-structured episode in that regard. And I heard someone else say, like, the other person who didn't think this episode was that bad, was that you gotta look at it like Airplane or like a comedy where they don't take it seriously and just think of every line they say in the episode as like a comedic line, and it makes sense in that regard. And in that way, it becomes a pure form of the so bad it's good, which is, I think it is, actually. I wouldn't list this in one of the worst episodes of Star Trek because I don't hate watching it. I can watch it and wreak enjoyment out of it, which I can't do for all the ones that are on my worst list, like freaking Tuvix, Bada Bing Bada Bang. Unlike that episode, this one actually is fun. And Endgame and other terrible, Turnabout Intruder and stuff like that. It's painful for me to watch those episodes, where this one, I enjoy it. Sorry. So it can't be one of the worst episodes, in my humble. Anyway, let me now get into my top 10. Well, I spent a lot of time talking about my honorable mentions, but let me get into my top 10 episodes that everyone else hates that aren't that bad. And my number 10 is Invasive Procedures from Deep Space Nine. Now, granted, I haven't heard a lot of people hate this, but it is pretty lowly rated on IMDb. It's in like the bottom 40, I think. And I've heard several people, I think including my sister, say that they did not like this episode at all. Call it a bad episode. I love this episode. I think it's always one of my favorites. I love Avery Brooks's like over the top acting in this episode. The way he goes, "Our friendship is over." Like that's amazing. And how at the end, like when Varad Dax tries to get away, he brings out the phaser and it's like, "Varad, don't call me Benjamin," and then shoots him. That's fucking awesome. It makes me want to get up and cheer. And it's suspenseful, like seeing Bashir like have to rip Jadzia Simeon out and apologize to her for doing it. Like that's emotional. It got me emotional. So I thought it was a good episode. Now, does it really make sense that Varad Dax would still try to betray them if he's joined with Dax? Not really, but I still like it. I think it's still a good episode. Anyway, let me get into my number 9. Episodes everyone else seems to hate that aren't really that bad, and that is Aquiel. I've always loved this. In fact, I used to love this episode, and as I got older, I kind of grew out of that. But I still like it. I still think it's a decent episode. I think it's interesting. Geordi actually gets lucky for once. You gotta appreciate that. And I thought it was a pretty suspenseful episode where Geordi's involved with this woman who's accused of murder, and everyone else thinks she did it. And it turns out, I thought it was a great twist that turned out to be her dog, that was like this weird creature thing. A lot of people put it down for that and saying that was stupid, and maybe it's because I was a teenager when I first saw it, but I thought it was fine. I can see as maybe it was kind of predictable, sure, and some of the parts of the episode are a bit melodramatic, but I still like it. I don't think it deserves the hate it gets. So next on my list is number 8 on my list, which is Rise from season 3 of Voyager. Now, this is this and 2 other episodes that came out at the same time as this is apparently is common for a lot of people to refer to it as the Trilogy of Terror from season 3. That is 3 terrible episodes in a row, and I refer to it as the fake Trilogy of Terror because it's actually not 3 bad episodes in a row, because I think it's Darkling, this episode, and Favorite Son. Now, Favorite Son almost made my list as well. I was considered for this top 10, but it's not that good of an episode, but it's certainly not as bad as everyone else seems to think it is. Like, I've definitely seen worse, like the real Trilogy of Terror. But anyway, and Darkling is the only bad episode in this fake Trilogy of Terror, because Rise is actually a really good episode. I've seen other people. Now, granted, on IMDb, this isn't rated that lowly, to be fair to this episode, but the fact that it's considered in the Trilogy of Terror, and I've seen several people online trash this episode, absolutely despise this episode, when I think it's actually pretty good. I think it's one of the better Tuvok and Neelix episodes. I love it. You know, the main storyline of them being in the space elevator where who murdered them was cliche and stereotypical, but I love it for the character story of Neelix and Tuvok, because and I particularly love this one because this is one when Neelix finally calls out Tuvok on his shit and calls him arrogant, which he absolutely is. He absolutely is arrogant, and he's absolutely constantly a dick to Neelix and not showing him proper consideration, and Neelix finally calls him out on this shit. So I love this episode for that. Granted, I don't think this is an amazing episode, but it's a good one. Like, I would say this is a solid episode, one of the ones I enjoyed out of season 3, which was a terrible season. By the way, the real Trilogy of Terror in season 3, the real Trilogy of Terror, regardless of what these other say that this fake Trilogy of Terror, no, the real Trilogy of Terror is, oh god, I think Darkling is also part of it, or maybe it's something else, but it's Coda, Blood Fever, and I think Darkling. That's the real Trilogy of Terror. Coda is one of the worst episodes. Blood Fever is terrible, and I agree Darkling deserves to be in the trilogy. So that's the real trilogy of terror. But anyway, let me get into my number 7, which is Vengeance Factor. Now, this is another episode of TNG that I used to love. Now, as I got older, I kind of grew out of it, but this used to be like, I would put this in my top 5 favorite TNG episodes when I was a teenager. But as I got older, I saw some of the flaws in it. Particularly, the biggest flaw that I think a lot of people are stuck on is, why did Riker kill that poor girl when he could have just stunned her a couple more times? She was already getting weak from the stunning. I mean, maybe she would have died if he kept stunning her, but he for sure would die if you freaking vaporize her. Maybe you should just try stunning her a couple more times. But anyway, that aside, and that is a huge flaw, I will admit. That aside, I liked the premise of the episode with the Gatherers and the political situation, Picard having to negotiate this rogue species of pirates that went off and lived, on robbing people and then trying to get them to reintegrate into society, for which they can, a society that was destroyed by a lot of clan wars, which I think is a lot of world building that I really appreciate, that a lot of these these episodes with one-off races don't do as deep or as interesting world building. So that's number 1 that really got me into this episode. Number 2 was, I actually thought the tragic love story from Riker and Yuta actually really worked, despite its terrible ending. The flaw with the ending, for sure, as I acknowledge, exists. But barring that, this actually really got me emotionally invested in the fact that there's this woman who felt like she was trapped to servitude to her ancestors and an obligation to kill these people, and Riker, not aware of this at first, but kind of knew that something was weighing on her and trying to get her to let it go and to treat it the way that he treated her like an equal, and how he made that important to her. That was really powerful, and it was also powerful the fact that the person Riker was hunting after, the murderer, that turned out to be the woman that he was in love with. That was also really powerful. So the ending does bar this from being a really great episode, so it wouldn't make any of my top 20s or 30s anymore, but it's still a solid episode, and a lot of people seem to act like it's one of the worst episodes of TNG, which I totally don't think it is. But, anywho, let me get into my number 6, Moist Vessel from Lower Decks. Again, this is something I just discovered when looking at the IMDB ratings, because I haven't seen anyone who really hate on this episode. Well, my sister talked about how she absolutely hated the storyline about the side plot about the guy who was ascending, and Tendi was trying to help him ascend, which I love that side plot. But outside of that, I hadn't really specifically heard anyone trash this episode. But when I went on to IMDb, again, this was in the top 5 lowest rated episodes. It was in the bottom 5. I'm like, what? This is in my top 5. Actually, when I did a best episode 20, top 10, 20 best episodes of Modern Trek, this made my top 20. And I think this will probably make my top 5 best episodes of Lower Deck. Maybe now with season 3 out, it might be more like a top 7. But I would have to look at it, but it's definitely in the top 10. It's definitely in that higher tier, because I thought it was a great episode. I thought it was one of the better episodes of season 1. You get the great character story with Mariner and her mother having to crawl through the ship while they're arguing and working through this shit. And I love the side plot with the freaking Ascension. How they saw the koala. That was hilarious. And it felt like a really adventurous Star Trek episode where the whole ship was terraforming and turning into a swampland. Like, I thought it was great. So I don't know why the hell this would be in the bottom 5 on IMDb. What the hell is wrong with people? Anyway, next is kind of a similar episode because it involves a starship getting turned into something else, is the TNG episode Masks. Now, this is the episode I've heard throttled again and again as an absolutely terrible episode. And you know what? I used to make these top 40 best episodes of TNG and watch them when I was an older teenager, like maybe 17, 18. And this one always made it. This was always in my top 40 best. Look, yes, it's silly. Brent Spiner is silly going, my soccer's working. Actually, that's kind of why I love that episode. But I think it's interesting because it really explores Picard's love for archaeology, and it makes it a real tangible threat that he could use his knowledge of archaeology to resolve the situation. And I think that was an interesting premise to do that, and it was interesting to create this whole mythology of this alien world and really get into the I think they did a good job world building there. Now, yes, Brent Spiner's performance could be over the top from time to time, but actually some of them I thought was quite chilling, particularly when he was like being this old man saying about it, oh, what for? Like, I thought that was a good performance, and how he'd switch back and forth between the different, like the concept of like Data like going insane because he had all these personalities within him, and he even said that to Geordi. It's like, how does one know when they're going insane? It was like a really chilling moment. So I actually think this is a decent episode. I don't know if I put it in my top 40 of TNG episodes now. In fact, I know I wouldn't, because I did one that I don't think this made it. But it's still good. I certainly don't think it deserves all the hate it gets. It gets a lot of hate. So, next we'll move along to my number 4. Move along home. Now, anyone familiar with my channel should know that this would make my list, because I've been very vocal about how I don't think this episode is terrible. In fact, when this first came out, I used to love this episode. And it wasn't until recently, like within the last 10 years, that I discovered that people hated this episode. And I was actually quite shocked to discover how much people hate this episode. I was surprised, because I always thought highly of this episode. Now, I read a lot of really detailed reviews and explanations and essays about why these particular people hated this episode, and I could see their point of view. Like, they bring up things like, well, of course, the obvious is how ridiculous it is for Sisko and the others to play these child games and go, Ultramarine, count to 4. But which never really bothered me, because the ridiculous things happen in ridiculous premises. But then they bring up better things, like the fact that the game actually doesn't make any sense, and they could have done a better job of describing an actual game and rules of the game, which I agree. But I think the premise of them meeting this species from the other side of the galaxy that's so alien that their games involve like going inside was an interesting premise. And I don't think it's that terrible. And then we had that great moment with Odo that I love, where the security guy is like, you can't just go beaming over there. And he's like, ooh, was that a Starfleet thing? Because I'm not in Starfleet. People know my channel know I quote that a lot. I'm sorry, I love that line. I was like, yes. And a lot of people were off put when he went, it's only a game. But I kind of like that. I kind of like that they were never in danger in the first place. Some people think it deflates the entire episode. I don't. I think it's funny. I don't know. And a lot of people will bring up, well, Avery Brooks can't stand this episode. While I see your Avery Brooks, and I raise you an Armin Shimmerman, who did love this episode and thought it was one of his favorite ones to perform. The one where he goes, like, so there. Anyway, I'll move over to my number 3, the Elysian Kingdom, which maybe I should have put this in my underrated list, but it belongs in this list too, because, alright, so this is the episode from Strange New Worlds that involved like the fantasy world where the Enterprise got turned into this fantasy of what's his Mbega's daughter, and he discovered this. A lot of people say this is the worst episode of Strange New Worlds. So you go on IMDb, it is the lowest rated episode of Strange New Worlds Season 1. And I've seen so many reviews where the people trash and hate this episode. I thought it was a masterpiece. I don't know if I'd go as far as to say it's in the top 20 best Trek episodes like I would with the Strange New Worlds Season 1 finale, but it's up there. It might make my top 50 of all Star Trek. Because they were comparing it to episodes like If Wishes Were Horses, where I would compare it to episodes like The Visitor or The Inner Light. It had that same, like, I was in tears by the end of this episode. It had that really strong emotional impact, and I absolutely love the revelation that this silly fantasy world, which was stakes because people's lives were at risk, but it was because of this alien entity bonded with his daughter who was in the transporter, limbo, and who he thought was going to die, and to see her like grow up as a woman and live as this energy being was so touching. And it was so touching to see him reunite with his daughter at the end, and she'd be like, "Did you have fun, Daddy?" And she's like, "Yes, I did." Like, it gets me. It has me in tears. I don't understand how people can say this is a terrible episode. This is an amazing episode. This is one of the most powerful ones. I think this is better than Darmok. That's how good I think this is. Anyway, we'll get into my number 2. Now, some people might expect this to be my number 1, because this is definitely the biggest disparity between how much I love this episode and how much other people hate it. But there's a reason why it only makes it to number 2, which I'll talk about when I get into my number 1. Anyway, my number 2 is The Alternative Factor, which, if you're familiar with my channel, is probably will make my top. I think it made my top 10 favorite original series episodes last time I did a top 10. Time before it was only an honorable mention, but I think this time was actually cracked my top 10. If you met me when I was 14 years old and you asked me what's your favorite Star Trek episode, Mark, I would say, or original series episode, I would say The Alternative Factor. Maybe City on the Edge of Forever, depending on my mood. But that's how highly I thought of this episode. Now, again, I didn't learn until somewhat recently, within the last 10 years, that people hated this episode. Now, unlike Move Along Home, where I can kind of see where people were coming from, I can't see where people are coming from when I try to look up reasons, because all the reasons, and I just explored this in the video I did for Alternative Factor, all the reasons people come up with is why this episode is terrible is it's boring, which is subjective. I don't think it's boring. But, so scratch that. Overacting. This is the original series. Have you seen the original series? Have you not seen the original series before? And then that it has junk science that makes no sense. Again, see argument A. Have you seen the original series before? Giant hand grabbing the starship, Abraham Lincoln floating in space, and you're caught up of some parallel universe story. Now, a lot of people falsely say, oh, it's a universe of antimatter and a universe of matter. But I saw that whole talk as an analogy, not like literally. They're taking it literally, which I'm taking it metaphorically, but I don't know. You could say I'm wrong, but even if I'm not, I don't think I've seen worse junk science than Star Trek for sure. Amoeba eating the entire galaxy. So those arguments don't make any sense. So I hate when people do this to me when they try to assign different motivations for why I don't like something. But I'm forced to do that because the motivations that I'm given don't compute. So I'm forced to come up with, well, all right, to be fair, to try to be extremely fair, that this episode was generally hated in the 60s, and that kind of carried on, and that hatred was learned, where episodes like Trouble with Tribbles were looked upon fondly, so that carried on through the generations. And I think the reason why it would be hated so much back then is because it's too intellectual. It's too much. It's too thinky, and people would rather see balls that purr and a pimp that's pimping up hot chicks to these minors, or Abraham Lincoln fighting Genghis Khan. Now, again, I might be totally being unfair, and maybe you think I'm being unfair, and that's fair to say I'm being unfair. But that's the only thing I can come up with, because the reasons I'm given, I don't accept because it applies to every episode of the original series. Although the boring thing, yes, but that's subjective, and I say no, it's not boring. It's actually interesting if you're into this intellectual stuff. Anyway, let me get to my number one. Number one, Star Trek episode everyone else hates. That isn't that bad. And my number one is These Are the Voyages. Now, this may seem odd because I actually think this is a bad episode. Unlike something like The Alternative Factor or The Elysium Kingdom, which I love those episodes. These Are the Voyages, I would just say, is a fairly bad episode. I give it a 4 out of 10. It's not, yeah. But the reason why I have to have this as my number one is because the level I hate and vitriol I am constantly bombarded with towards this episode, I think is completely unearned, and it really starts to annoy me. Like, I can't watch a YouTube video without someone trashing this episode and putting it down and calling it the worst finale of Star Trek, which clearly is nowhere near the worst finale of Star Trek. That's Endgame, which is the worst finale ever made, ever, which I talked about in the other video I did. It's nowhere, it's not 1/10, 100th as bad as Endgame. But, so that's why I had to have it as my number one, because I'm sick of people trashing this episode. There's like the entire first season of Enterprise is worse than this episode. Okay, well, that's maybe an exaggeration. Okay, so maybe there's like the Dear Doctor episode is pretty good, and maybe that the one, what's the one Fallen Hero where they're just that chase. That's in Shockwave, that was pretty decent. But yeah, most of the episodes of season 1 are way worse than this one. In fact, when I did my top 15 worst episodes of Enterprise, I made a disclaimer that there would be only season 1 and 2 episodes, because season 1 and 2 was worse than anything the later seasons did, and none of the later seasons. And that included this one, which I only gave a 4 out of 10. I think there's half the episodes of Enterprise are probably worse than this one. I would say, like, okay, so this, and I don't know, because people's argument is that it was a terrible finale for Enterprise because it focuses on Riker and Troy and them going into the holodeck. So we actually don't see Enterprise characters in real life, and plus there's a 10-year time jump from the previous episode, or however long. I think it wasn't 10 years. I can't remember. Someone might have corrected me on that. But however long of a time jump, there's a time jump. I think maybe it was 10 years from season 1, so maybe it was like a 6-year. I don't know. But regardless, however long the time jump was, there was a time jump. And that might have alienated people, and the fact that they're choosing to end the show on a episode focused on Next Generation characters, which Endgame also fucking did, by the way, by having Barclay be a member of Voyager, which he had no fucking business being, but well, to be fair, this focuses more on Troy and Riker than Endgame did on Barclay, but still, I don't see it that way, because I see it as actually a cool way to connect the series to this greater whole. I think it was actually a kind of smart way to end the show, especially since it ended so suddenly, was to show this pivotal moment of, the Federation forming, which I'm glad we jumped to that. I would love seeing that. They could have done a better job with it. For sure, as I said, I don't think this is a masterpiece. I still think it's a bad episode. Sure, they could have done a better job with it, but it's a good concept, and I think the concept of having Riker look back at Enterprise in history, it ties the whole franchise together, and especially how they did the different voiceovers of These Are the Voyages thing, sort of tying it into the greater whole. I thought it was actually a beautiful way to end the series. And I hate Trip, and so the how they killed him off unceremoniously, I get a kick out of that, to be honest. Which, again, I know most people love Trip, and so that's another disagreement we have. He reminds me too much of George W. Bush, and that was intentional, and I won't even get into how much I loathe that particular figure in history. So I never liked Trip. And so when they kill him off unceremoniously, I get a kick out of it, to be honest, and how nobody gives a shit. I love that. I'm sorry. So that's kind of cynical. But so maybe I shouldn't mention that. But honestly, like, yeah, it's silly to have Riker go in this holodeck program. Oh, and the fact they tried to fit it in the Pegasus episode, which it absolutely does not fit into that episode. Another reason why I think it's a bad episode. But it's not that bad. Like, there's way worse. Enterprise, there's literally like 30, 40 episodes of Enterprise worse than this. And don't even talk about finales. This barely registers. It didn't even make my top 10 worst finales. There's way worse series finales from tons of shows. This barely scratches the surface because it was decent. At least it tried to connect to the greater franchise. So yeah, that's my number one. Episodes everyone else hates, which actually aren't that bad. So that's it for this particular top 10. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully this did not anger you. You can check out the companion piece I did on this recently for the top 10 episodes I hate that everyone else seems to like. And also check out my channel for many more Star Trek videos and other videos of the sort. And I do want to give a big thank you, shout out to my Patreon supporters, those who support me on Patreon, keep the channel going, they keep me living, they're the lifeblood of the channel. Anthony Debectus, Ricky, Manny Jester, Joel Avals, Brian A, Alessandro Miguelesio. I'm guess the pronunciation for that. I still could be totally mispronouncing that, but I'm being more consistent with my mispronunciation, at least that. Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kennedy, Britton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon House. Thank you so much for your support, all of you. It's very much appreciated. As I said, lifeblood of this channel. But even if you're not a Patreon supporter, even if you're just subscribed and you like my videos, it's also extremely appreciated. So be sure to to subscribe so you can keep up with everything that I do. And thanks a lot for watching.